I am I'm sitting together with Harvey Kwiyani, and Harvey is teaching in Liverpool, teaching missiology, and we're doing an interview around Harvey as an African immigrant and a scholar, the understanding of the meaning of place for us as Christians in the West. But before we begin that, Harvey, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? You're an immigrant, you're in the UK, but you actually spent a lot of time in the US. So talk a little bit about your journey and how you ended up at the university there in Liverpool.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Harvey Kwiyani. I come from Malawi. I worked in mission in Europe and North America for the past 16, 17 years, spending the first 3 years in Germany, 4 years in the UK, and almost 7 years in the US, and then came back to the UK. I came from Malawi around 2000, at a time when Malawi was experiencing a huge revival. People converting to Christianity by their thousands every day. And found myself in St. Gallen, North Switzerland. And it was the opposite. It was almost felt like Christianity didn't exist at all. And that provoked me to begin to think, how do we do a missiology that connects with Western people? How do we talk about missions? How do we talk about God's mission among Westerners in a way that Westerners understand? And that led me to come to Britain, do a master's in missions, and then move to Minnesota, do a PhD in missions. And then I came back to work and teach at first in Oxford with Church Mission Society, and now at Liverpool Hope University, where I am sort of working with and taking over from Andrew Wars in his World Christianity, World Missiology Studies. Mm-hmm. So that's my journey.
Yeah. And you've been in Liverpool now about 5 months?
Just 5 months, just starting.
Yeah.
Also good. I'm enjoying it.
And your family, how are your family adjusting to all those moves?
Well, they're settling in well. Our older girl, who is 4 years old, 4 and probably 3 months, beginning to pick up the Liverpool accent. To the concern of my wife, who is not necessarily about that. But yeah, it's getting into a new place, getting to know people, getting to know the land, making connections with whatever is happening here. And so far it's been good. It's been a good experience.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So that's part of what we want to talk about today. The theme we're looking at right now in our journal is the meaning of place, Christian life, particularly here in the West. And some of us who were born in the West, often majority white folk, have some conflicting values around place anymore. There's a sense in which it's where we belong, it's where we are, but there's also a growing sense that place, a particular geography, is less and less important given the social media, technological, globalized world in which we live.
Yes.
So one of the challenging questions is, what is the meaning of place, of being located, of dwelling in a place for Christian life and witness in the West? And to talk to that as someone who is not from that West, but is an immigrant into it.
So on the one hand, I'm an African, and to processing these questions and these issues as an African, first thing that comes to mind is, how do we as Africans think about place? Mm-hmm. How do we think about our location? Now, how do we think about what God is doing in our geographical location? Now, growing up in Malawi, at a time when Malawian Christianity was exploding, one of the things that really made that possible was the fact that I use the phrase the evangelisthood of all saints.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, taking it from the priesthood of all saints.
Mm-hmm.
And that evangelisthood of all saints, all believers are involved in mission and evangelism, but that is rooted in place. So wherever you are called to engage in God's mission, evangelizing people around you.
Mm-hmm.
The mission is the primary core, and the geography, the location, is where you are located now, but you could be moved to another city next week.
Mm.
Whether you move or not, wherever you move to, you continue to be an evangelist. You continue to be somebody who shares the good news of the mission of God. So for us growing up Christians in Africa, place becomes where God has placed you. Mostly, most of the people will say for a purpose. Mm-hmm. So Esther 4:14 is a verse that we talk about a lot. That God has placed you there for a season as this. And so the bigger core is in mission. You are involved in God's mission, but that God's mission is. But your geographical location is responding to that mission. Mm-hmm. That wherever you go, you are placed for such a time as this. That you continue to share the good news. You continue to engage in God's mission, and that really shapes a lot of the way Africans think about mission when they come to Europe or North America. Mm-hmm. They are still thinking, we are the evangelists, we are the Christians that God has called to engage in mission, but not just in a sense of some abstract place, but exactly where we are here is where God has placed us, and He has placed us for a purpose. Mm-hmm. When I go around African churches in England, I hear this a lot, that you are here for such a time as this. You are here, you are in this country, you are among these people for a purpose. God has planted you in this land so that you can reach out to the people. And that's, now, I think what I find interesting there is that the focus is almost entirely on mission, and the geography, the location is responding to that. You're not starting with the geography and then calling on mission. You're starting with mission, and then the geography supports that. So if you move from Liverpool to Birmingham, you are still on a mission. It's just a different location. And you continue the mission. You continue engaging in mission in a different location.
Gotcha. So let me ask you to reflect upon this in terms of a how would I say this? A predominantly white Anglo or European church. Mm-hmm. You're describing the understanding of mission and place from the perspective of an African and an immigrant. Mm-hmm. What I'd like you to comment on is that in so many current existing churches of a predominantly white culture, or even church plants, place is almost non-existent. That is, there's a building that you go to have meetings, and you might want to find other people to attract them there. And so for those for whom, say, the UK or Canada or North America is our home, our place, our real estate, there's almost no sense of being located in place. And I wonder whether, to use your language, for those kind of people like me, is it possible to imagine mission without first being rooted in place? Because we are so disconnected from place. Am I making sense?
Yes, I think I'm getting you.
Yeah. I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Well, now, again, I'm using my African lenses.
That's what I want you to do.
Looking at the West. I think one of the baggages that we have to rethink when we talk about mission and church in the world today is really the fact that church is possible in a typical Western sense. Church is possible. It's possible to do church with people that are basically focusing on the church as being a community of friends.
Right.
Because they are a community of friends, they can manage to be the community without thinking about the place, without thinking about the neighbors who are not involved in that community.
That's yeah.
And that for me raises the question of can we then talk about mission if church is just this group of people who know one another fairly well, they get to hang out together on a Sunday at a particular place, but the place doesn't really matter for them.
Mm-hmm.
The neighborhood doesn't really, they're not paying attention to what's happening in the neighborhood. The place doesn't exist in their minds. What they are looking at is, let's get together on a Sunday morning. Let's enjoy church, without really paying attention to what else is happening around us, what's happening in our village, what's happening in our location, what's happening in our town. And can we do that and then claim that we're engaging in God's mission? Mm-hmm. Even if we would say we are engaging in God's mission by sending missionaries to Africa and to Asia, but can we claim that this is really we're doing this in God's mission when we don't look around us, when we don't pay attention to our own neighborhoods? Mm-hmm. I find that problematic. Now, I've seen two occasions where, with my own eyes, the church has moved from one location to another, and the neighbors don't notice it. Right. It's gone. They're not interested. These people didn't know us. They didn't think about us. They didn't. The first one was a white British church that moved. They managed to get a better building somewhere. The second one was an African immigrant church that moved because they had bought a building somewhere as well. Mm-hmm. But they are both moving, leaving their location to another location without registering to the people in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. They had, in both cases, they had come in on Sunday morning, driven from long distances to be in church on Sunday, and then go back. No connection whatsoever with their location. Looking at that, thinking from an African perspective, that doesn't look like we are really engaging in mission if we don't engage in the place where God has placed us. Mm. Most Africans will again say, wherever you are, God has placed you for a reason, for such a time as this.
So let's explore that a little bit, because as I understand it from the perspective of North America, there has been quite a significant movement of emigration or migration of African Christians into the UK.
Yes.
And so I'd love to hear some stories or examples you may have of how some of those African communities have begun to express that sense of call to mission in particular places in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have a brilliant story of a Nigerian pastor in the Redeemed Christian Church of God in Newcastle.
Mm.
He's been around the UK for, I think, 6-7 years now. But 3 years into his stay in the UK, we met up in Birmingham at Formation with Martin and the guys.
Yes.
And we talked about Mission Day, trying to give them language to express what they were sensing God was doing through their work in Newcastle.
Mm-hmm.
And the importance of him paying attention to the fact that he is in Newcastle and God has placed him there for a purpose.
Right.
So in the conversation, we talked about things like how in your geographical location would you find places where the people who are not necessarily Nigerians, who are not necessarily migrants, but they hang out, they get together just to enjoy life.
Yeah.
It happened that very close to his house was a pub, and for British people, the pub is an important gathering place.
Yeah.
And he happens to be somebody who is so fascinated with football.
Mm.
So the Wednesday after our meeting in Birmingham, he's back in Newcastle. He decides, like for the first time in his life, to go to this pub. He the way he tells the story, he has an argument with his wife who does not understand how a Nigerian pastor can enter a pub. But of course, she lets him go. He gets into the pub, he gets his lemonade, he sits down, and everybody in the pub, and the people have seen him in the neighborhood for a long time. And so in the pub, they're looking at him strange, like, what are you doing here? What's happening? And there was football on telly. He begins to watch that, and the people ask him, what are you doing here? What? And he says, I'm here to watch football, which of course the British find fascinating.
Love, yeah.
And somebody said, do you support any team? And he says, yes, of course, I support Newcastle. It was Newcastle playing, and he was in Newcastle. So that connected with the people. Once he said that, the people in the pub, most of the people in the pub came and sat down on the table where he was alone before.
No kidding.
Barriers broken.
You bet.
And he gets into conversations with these people that 3 months later, the people that he met in the pub that night helped him host a football tournament for young boys 9 to 11. And they brought their friends, they brought their celebrity friends. It became a serious event that came out of just somebody deciding, I will do something that connects me with this location, with these people. And that's now it's almost 4 years later. The tournament has grown. It's still going on, and it has brought its own connections. So he's quite busy. His congregation has just planted 2 other congregations within the same area.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yes. And that is coming from the fact that he has stayed committed to this location. This is where God has placed us.
Yeah.
Let us be faithful to why God has placed us here.
And it's more than commitment to just this location. It's like he was crossing a lot of boundaries in terms of culture, ethnicity, class. He was going way out of what we would call the comfort zone to do that. That's a whole sense. It doesn't sound like what he was doing was just saying, who are other Africans like me that I can gather together? A whole different sense of engagement with place.
Yeah.
That's stunning.
He was not looking for the Africans. He made a decision to look for the locals.
Yeah.
And so the place, the neighbors become important.
Yeah. I wonder, Harvey, you said this and mentioned it, but if you could just reflect a little more on the sort of the theological narratives that lie behind this description that you're giving. So, for example, and you may see it differently, when I listen to a lot of people in churches of my racial group, they do talk about what I would describe as affinity. Come together to support and love and care for each other. And when they think of evangelism, they'll often say things like, if people knew how wonderful and warm and caring we were, they'd love to come and join us.
Yeah.
That's all affinity stuff. And there's a certain theological read around that.
Sure.
Whereas, and I don't want to romanticize, part of what you're saying is that what is drawing a community of God's people together of, let's say, African immigrants is a sense of God has called us here to this place to live a kingdom life. And in the illustration you gave, what might that look like? Talk a little bit more about the kind of theological imagination that's informing that perspective. Because the other one I get as I listen is this deep conviction that the Holy Spirit's actually doing something in neighborhoods. Anyway, talk about it.
Yeah. So let's start with the Spirit.
Yeah.
A lot of African Christianity is at the moment influenced by Spirit-centered reading of the Bible, a Spirit-centered understanding of the world. And that for Africans is coming from the culture that the general, the wider, even non-Christian culture is Spirit-centered. So when they become Christians, charismatic Christianity or enthusiastic Christianity makes sense to them.
Yeah.
And it helps them because the Spirit is ubiquitous already in their culture. The Spirit is already at work in outside Christianity. It helps them when they become Christians to begin to understand that the work of the Spirit of God now, not the Spirit they knew before they became Christians.
Yep.
The work of the Spirit now continues, and really our call as Christians is to discern what the Spirit is doing and join and be part of it. And they bring that understanding with them when they come abroad, when they come to Britain, when they come to North America. They are still believing that most of them would actually say the journey was made possible. This migration has been made possible by the help of the Spirit of God.
So the whole story of their journey, of their life, is
Yes.
rooted in this is what the Spirit of God is doing.
Yes. It's common for people to say, I got my visa by miracle because somebody prayed for it.
Right. Yeah.
Those stories are everywhere.
Yeah.
And that's their outlook. God is at work, and that's what has brought me here.
Right.
I hear them so many times. We are not here for the pound, and we're not here for this. Yes, we can come for education, we can come for other things, but the real reason that God has brought us here is for mission. So there is that sense of talking about God's urgency in even big things like migration.
Right.
That God is moving people from Africa, or moving people around for the sake of God's mission. God's agency is there in their migration.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I see that, and it's a deeply beguiling and inviting way of life. I wonder whether you have any reflections on how. Well, I'll say this. For me, the notions of I'm called here by the Spirit as an agent of what God is up to ahead of us tends not to be the dominant narrative of the kind of the Euro-tribal churches.
Sure.
I wonder what your observations and learnings are about how those ways of Christian life that seem natural to African immigrants might be introduced into the ways of life of the Euro-tribal church.
Yeah, I believe that in the coming together of people from different parts of the world, Christians, we help one another see God better. We help one another understand God better. And so I'm really convinced that the presence of African Christians in the West is something that's helpful, that's good for Western Christianity as a whole. Now, what I find interesting is really the fact that, for example, African Christians, they come in, they have a different worldview from Westerners, which could be helpful for mission, for theology, for other things in the West, but they struggle to communicate it to Westerners in a way that Westerners will. Right? So the good things about the Spirit become sort of freakish for Westerners. You're talking about the Spirit in a way that we don't find it understandable or understandable.
Yeah.
And yet the African is really saying that there's nothing I can do without the Spirit.
Yeah.
This is everything to me. But he's saying it in a way that Westerners find not that helpful.
Right.
And so it's learning how to communicate cross-culturally, both Westerners and Africans and other than Westerners, to communicate to each other in a way that makes communication possible. That we share the gifts that God has given us. There are gifts that the Western Church has for African Christians, and there are gifts that African Christians, Korean Christians, Latin American Christians bring to the table.
Yeah.
How do we talk to one another? And that I find the difficult question.
Well, I think you're, in one sense, naming a critical next steps, not the word I want to use, but if we raise the question of can the West be converted, or what, not even beyond that, if we raise the question of how do we join with what God is doing in the West, then part of the response is we need to learn how to listen to one another across racial, cultural differences, recognizing that in that mix is the ferment of the Spirit.
That's right. Yes.
Right. That's a wonderful gift and a way to frame perhaps some of the critical things that need to take place.
Sure.
What are those listening tables going to look like?
Yes.
Who hosts those listening tables?
Who holds the mic?
Who holds the mic?
That's right.
Yeah. That's extremely helpful. That's
Sure.
really, really helpful.